Greetings and salutations. It is I, Mr. Nothing, the museum curator of the weird and the strange, and the host who might be a ghost. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the strange and unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels throughout the apocalypse. Today, it is Poetry Thursday, a great day to talk about, all the not all the poems, but quite a lot of poetry that exists in the world, whether it be dark and foreboding, or light and happy, or comedic, or what have you. It is October, so I thought I would examine a poem about darkness and war and death and a whole bunch of horrible things. I am talking about Darkness by Lord Byron, George Gordon. An interesting poem, not 100% a fan of, but we'll get to why in a little bit. But I thought I'd talk about that poem. I've decided this month to forego talking about Edgar Allan Poe, his poems, mainly because while I do like The Raven, his other poems are kind of, not that great. And I know that's going to get me excommunicated from BookTube for saying that, especially because so many people view Poe as like an important figure in literature. And like his books and his short stories are great, but his poems leave a lot to be desired, mainly because he's just talking about, women who are frozen in time, and that's not really like something that I'm interested in. He does have a couple pretty dark poems worth exploring, but I'll leave that to Lucas over at Bits of Lit to take you through that. Meanwhile, I'll be exploring, Lord Byron and other poets throughout this month. Now that I've sufficiently slandered Edgar Allan Poe, allow me to sufficiently slander Lord Byron. And I know I said I didn't like Poe, but I'm not a big fan of Lord Byron. His poems kind of feel a bit self-aggrandizing at times, like he's writing for himself rather than any particular audience. And that's a problem I have mainly with the romance poets in general. Like every now and then you'll find a good poem from a romance poet, but a lot of it is just like focusing on telling a grand story or something like that in poem format. And none of these people are Virgil or Homer, but they choose to try to tell grand epics, and that's not when they're up their own ass at times talking about other things. And so the romance, field isn't my favorite, but you do get a couple of good poems every now and then. Lord Byron is kind of one of those people. My problem with him is I feel like his influence is a bit outsized. Especially mainly because he was a writer who was associated with other writers, so they were traveling around at the time, and people, I think just close proximity to one another leads people to think that Lord Byron and his various writer friends were important, when maybe we can ignore a couple of them, or maybe we don't have to view them as big influences as maybe they probably weren't. And I'm saying a lot that's going to get me in trouble, but, I'm still holding true to my statement there. And Lord Byron, writing stories and whatnot, when he wasn't doing that, he was romancing some of his cousins, and he also found time to get involved in the Greek War for Independence. And that's where he ended up dying. So, quite a interesting life filled with writer friends and writing himself and war and all such kind of things. And one of the poems that he wrote was Darkness, which I'll be talking today. So without further ado, let's get to Darkness. It's a bit of a longer poem, so I'll try to be brief in my analysis, but I will provide a bit of summary of the poem, a little bit of analysis, and we'll move on from there. Darkness. I had a dream which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space. Rayless and pathless on the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. Morn came and came and brought no day, and men forgot their passions in the dread of their desolation. And all hearts were chilled into a selfish prayer for light, and they did live by watchfires. And the thrones, the palaces of crowned kings, the huts, the habitations of all things which dwell, were burnt for beacons, cities were consumed. And men were gathered round their blazing homes to look more into each other's face. Happy were those who dwelt within the eye of the volcanoes and their mountain torch. A fearful hope was all the world contained. Forests were set on fire, but hour by hour they fell and faded, and the crackling trunks extinguished with a crash, and all was black. The brows of men, by the despairing light, wore an unearthly aspect. As by fits, the flashes fell upon them. Some lay down and hid their eyes and wept, and some did rest, their chins upon their clenched hands, and smiled. And others hurried to and fro, and fed their funeral piles with fuel, and looked up with mad disquietude on the dull sky. The pall of a past world, and then again, with curses cast them down upon the dust, and gnashed their teeth, and howled. The wild birds shrieked, and terrified did flutter on the ground, and flapped their useless wings. The wildest brutes came tame and tremulous, and vipers crawled and twined themselves among the multitude. Hissing, but stingless, they were slain for food, and war, which for a moment was no more, did glut himself again. A meal was bought with blood, and each sate sullenly apart, gorging himself in gloom. No love was left. All earth was but one thought, and that was death, immediate and inglorious. And the pang of famine fed upon all entrails. Men died, and their bones were tombless as their flesh. The meager by the meager were devoured, even dogs assailed their masters, all save one. And he was faithful to a course, and kept the birds and beasts and famished men at bay, till hunger clung them, or the dropping dead lured their lank jaws. Himself sought out no food, but with a piteous and perpetual moan, and a quick desolate cry, licking the hand which answered not with a caress, he died. The crowd was famished by degrees, but two of an enormous city did survive, and they were enemies. They met beside the dying embers of an altar palace, where had been heaped a mass of holy things for an unholy usage. They racked up and shivering scrapped with their cold skeleton hands the feeble ashes, and their feeble breath blew for little life, and made a flame which was a mockery. Then they lifted up their eyes as it grew lighter, and beheld each other's aspects, saw and shrieked and died. Even of their mutual hideousness they died. Unknowing who he was upon whose brow famine had written fiend. The world was void, the populous and the powerful was a lump, seasonless, herbless, treeless, manless, lifeless. And lump of death, a chaos of hard clay. The rivers, lakes, and ocean all stood still, and nothing stirred within their depths. Ships, sailorless, lay rotting on the sea, and their masts fell down piecemeal as they dropped. They slept on the abyss without a surge. The waves were dead, the tide were in their grave, the moon their mistress had expired before. The winds were withered in the stagnant air, and the clouds perished. Darkness had no need of aid from them. She was the universe. So that was Darkness by Lord Byron. It's a pretty enjoyable poem. The first thing, in terms of analysis, the first thing that I noticed was the atmosphere and the dark nature and the apocalypse kind of setting for the poem, because there are a lot of things going wrong in this poem. The sun goes out, the moon goes out. The people don't know what to do on land. They start warring with one another. Volcanoes explode, and the forests catch fire, and everything is burnt down, and cities just become a wasteland. And eventually everyone dies, and darkness consumes the entire world. It's not a very optimistic poem. At the very beginning, the narrator says, "I had a dream which was not all a dream." So it's suggesting that this might be prophecy in the narrator's mind. It hasn't happened yet, but it's probably going to happen in the near future. What will be the catalyst for this? The narrator doesn't say, but whatever it's going to be that's going to cause something of this scale of destruction, it's going to be quite hectic and quite scary. Another thing I noticed about this poem, which I like that he touches upon, is Lord Byron's use of biblical themes. Specifically, I think he's referring to the Armageddon in this poem. First, he's talking about death, famine, and war. He doesn't talk about pestilence for some reason, the other horsemen of the apocalypse. But it is clear that he is talking about death because everyone is dying. He's talking about famine because famine fed upon the entrails of the people in this poem. And he also says, "And war, which for a moment was no more, did glut himself again." Which I feel is very significant because he's saying, did glut himself again. He's characterizing war in a way that the Bible does when you have the horsemen of the apocalypse. So it could just be that he's providing, because he does that a couple times with darkness, calling darkness a she. But I think it's more along the lines that he's referencing the apocalypse here. And another thing that comes along with the apocalypse is that he's describing in an enormous city how there are two people there are two people in an enormous city, and they were enemies, and so they met and they fought. And I think what he's describing here is the Christ and the Antichrist, two people who are there at the end of the world fighting it out, presumably for human souls. But he also says that whereas the Bible describes it as a heroic event, in here he's describing these people as famine ravished and skeleton practically, and they pretty much die at each other's hideousness. So it's not as noble as the Bible leads you to believe, and I like that aspect, how he changes our preconceived notions of what the climactic biblical battle would look like. However, there is one thing that I don't like about this poem, and that is how long it is. It just seems to go on, and I feel like at certain times Byron is repeating himself, where he's just oh, darkness is coming and it's swallowing everything and everything gets destroyed, and there are times where it's just he's going on, he's using more words than he needs, he's being verbose. And part of this poem reminds me of The Second Coming by Yeats, where you have the beast slouching towards Bethlehem, another sort of prophetic vision. Which I enjoy. I think I enjoyed that poem more than this one, just because, it's much more succinct. It says exactly what it needs to, and not a word more. But this one, it feels a bit extra, and it kind of hurts the poem a little bit, in my opinion. Anyway, I think this is a pretty good poem, one of the better Romance era poems. Pretty solid, and I'll put a link to it in the description so you can find it and go read it. Also, go read The Second Coming by Yeats, because that is a pretty good poem in and of itself. Worth checking out and comparing the two. And if you have anything to say about either of the poems, I will put, or make sure to comment below. And I would love to hear from you. I would love to have a discussion about poems on Poetry Thursday. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe so that we can get Poetry Thursday out to the masses again. It's important that the world knows about great poetry, even if it does come from Lord Byron. In the meantime, I wish you the best of times in your weird and dark travels. Farewell.